For certain people on carnivore, the lion diet is the missing piece that just makes everything click. But what even is the lion diet? Who would benefit from it and why? In today's video, we're going to be answering just that. I'll go through the pros and the cons of the lion diet, as well as share my experience with 3 months on it. By the end of this video, you'll know whether or not the lion diet is right for you. For certain people, the lion diet is not only necessary, but essential. Take, for example, Jordan Peterson, who is a world-famous psychiatrist. He is the 4th most viewed episode ever on the Joe Rogan podcast, the biggest podcast in the world. The lion diet changed his life. For starters, he lost a lot of weight. He woke up in the morning with more energy. All his brain fog lifted. But to him, the most important thing that he experienced was his lifelong depression went away. Now, he had tried every single drug, but the only thing that he could get to fix his depression, now keep in mind, he's the leading psychiatrist in the world, was the lion diet. But where things get interesting is that if he goes off the lion diet, even if he eats other carnivore foods, this depression comes back. And for an entire month, he is sent into a state of doom. What's even more fascinating is that his daughter Michaela experiences the same. Growing up, she had chronic arthritis. She had to have 2 joints replaced before the age of 20. The lion diet fixed all of it. Her arthritis, which they thought was incurable, went away. She also had this chronic depression her father had. And exactly like her father, if she eats a carnivore food that is not part of the lion diet, her arthritis and depression comes back. These are 2 examples of people that need the lion diet. Now, before we get into why the lion diet is so essential for some, what even is the lion diet? Well, on carnivore, you can have all meats, eggs, and dairy. But lion diet is like carnivore on steroids. All you can have is ruminant meat, salt, and water. Okay, but what even is a ruminant animal, and why is it so important? A ruminant animal is an animal with a very complex multi-chambered stomach. This is very different to, say, a monogastric animal such as chicken or pigs, as they have a much less complex digestive system that only has one chamber. So essentially, these ruminant animals are much better able to digest, break down, and absorb everything they're given. And it ends in their meat being more pure, I guess you would call it. It has a lot less toxins than what we see in some monogastric animals, which we'll get to shortly. One thing that is often not discussed is that ruminant animals are also much more likely to be fed their species-appropriate diet. This is incredibly essential, as for a species to be able to break something down, it must have consumed it for an extended period of time. The reason for this is, well, as we all know, plants have defense compounds, and without sufficient adaptations to break down these defense compounds, they end up harming us. And just by the way, if you believe in God, if you're a creationist, then your view is God gave these animals these traits to be able to break down these defense compounds. They didn't develop them through evolution, they were given them from the start. But whatever your worldview, a species-appropriate diet is incredibly important. A great example of this is with goats. The grass they eat contains a defense compound called tannins. Now, goats have eaten grass for a very long time. So in their saliva, there's an enzyme called tannins, which breaks down these tannins. However, if humans ate that same grass, these tannins would be toxic to us. But the thing with ruminant animals is their species-appropriate diets are usually grass. They also don't need roofs, sheltering. So what typically happens is ruminant animals are left alone in fields, where they get to eat their species-appropriate diet. Whereas animals such as chicken and pigs, their species-appropriate diet is pasture, but it's not very often that monogastric animals are left out and allowed to graze in the pasture. So what they end up feeding them is these pellets. Now, these pellets are just toxic sludge. So what happens is they eat the stuff, but because it's not their species-appropriate diet, they can't break it down. And when we examine their fatty acid profile, it's very high in the inflammatory omega-6 fatty acids, and much lower in what people commonly refer to as the good fats in omega-3 fatty acids. In particular, it's very high in linoleic acid, which we know is inflammatory to humans. Now, these fatty acids can cause a number of problems for many individuals, but let me first answer a question that I know you have. What's wrong with pasture-raised monogastric animals? Well, for starters, they are still monogastric animals, so it just ends up in their meat being slightly less pure, which some people find to be problematic. But to get very technical, it's borderline impossible to get some of these animals to consume their true species-appropriate diet. Wild chickens, they don't hang out in big fields. If they did, if they were out in the open, they would get destroyed by predators. If you're a fox minding your own business, galloping the countryside, and you stumbled upon a massive group of chickens out in the open, it'd be a field day. You'd be fed for weeks. It'd be one of the greatest days of your life. So chickens, they have to hide. They go into the forests and they hide amongst the trees. They stay much more hidden. So essentially there's no real such thing as chickens that actually eat their 100% true species appropriate diet, because the plants that eat in the forest are slightly different to the plants they consume when they're pasture raised. So how will these omega-6 fatty acids affect you? Well, for one, it can slow down your metabolism ever so slightly. Now, this isn't super major. A lot of the other effects will be a lot more noticeable than this one. However, if we get real technical, Technically, this inflammation obviously is going to damage our cells. In particular, the mitochondria, which produces our energy, at least to some degree, will be slightly affected, which means it's not going to function at full capacity. You're going to produce slightly less energy. Therefore, your energy output's going to be a bit slower. And remember, fat is stored energy. So the more energy output we have, in theory, we're burning more fat. So if you remove some of these other carnivore foods that may just be a little bit toxic, your metabolism might speed up ever so slightly. But the main benefit of lion diet when it comes to a fat loss perspective is that you're not consuming other carnivore foods such as milk, which people tend to gain weight on. It can also affect autoimmune conditions. An autoimmune condition is where your body mistakenly attacks its own cells, thinking that they are a foreign threat. So when your cells actually are inflamed, there's a lot greater probability that your immune system is going to target them. So this one's pretty self-explanatory. You can imagine what happens when you remove the inflammatory foods. And that's why carnivore is so effective at reversing these autoimmune conditions. The next major effect, which like we saw demonstrated with the case of the Petersons at the start, is how lion diet can affect your mood and hormones. In particular, we're going to look at dopamine and serotonin. These are two of the key hormones that make you happy. In fact, if you were to go to a psychiatrist and say, hey, I'm depressed, I've been feeling a bit down, what can you give me? They would say, hey, take this pill. It's called an SSRI, which stands for Selective Serotonin Reuptake Inhibitor. Now, without getting too technical, how this drug works is that it prevents your body from absorbing serotonin, so there's more in your system, rah. Not important, but my point being is that the number one drug used to treat depression, used to treat anxiety, is a drug that upregulates the amount of serotonin you have. But you know what no one talks about? 90% of this serotonin is made in our guts. Now, when your gut's damaged, it's got this inflammation, it's a lot less effective at synthesizing, or producing, should I say, all of these hormones, which is why so many people, they go on carnivore, and without any circumstance change in their life, they see their depression, they see their anxiety lifted. So again, it's pretty straightforward. Remove the inflammation, and you're going to function a lot better. Another great benefit of the lion diet is that it removes cravings. Some of these carnivore foods, in particular dairy, because it's sweet, in some individuals it can just mean that the cravings just never really go away. Now, a lot of people don't know this, but the main driver behind cravings is the pleasure hormone called dopamine. Essentially, whenever you do activities, your brain releases a different amount of dopamine. The more dopamine it releases, the better you feel. So what happens is when you consume something sweet, you get a massive release of dopamine. Now, the human psyche is wired in a way where we're constantly either avoiding pain or seeking pleasure. And so as a way to seek pleasure, you get cravings to have this thing again. However, when you abstain from something for 2 weeks, your brain forgets how much pleasure it got from it, and the addiction's broken. So when you don't avoid these sweet things, your brain's constantly being reminded of how amazing sweet things are, and you get the craving. But on the lion diet, because you're not consuming any of that, what people find is that all their cravings go away. Now, what I typically see happen for most people is sort of a natural progression to a lion diet, or a lion diet with eggs. Due to ruminant meat being the most nutrient dense because of its complex digestive system and its abilities to extract all the nutrients from its food, and the fact that it's not inflammatory, and the fact that it's also the most filling, your body gets so positively reinforced by it that you sort of get to a point where it's sort of the only carnivore meat that you want to eat. Now, this doesn't happen to all people, I'm generalizing here, but there's a lot of people on carnivore that find they just naturally end up eating only ruminant meat anyway. Now, this is basically what's happened to me. My diet right now is basically only ruminant meat and eggs. Now, I did do the lion diet for 3 months, but I did actually stop. Earlier this year, I was just a regular person on the carnivore diet. I was consuming a bit of everything, including milk. Now, the problem with pasteurized milk is when they heat it to these high temperatures to kill the bad bacteria, so it lasts longer. In doing so, they also denature some of the proteins, which makes it inflammatory. So I was still having a few skin issues. My entire life I had acne, and I was still getting a few breakouts. So I thought, you know what, we'll get rid of this, eating the one food that causes absolutely zero inflammation. So I did that for a few months. Sure enough, my acne completely went away. I felt incredible, unlimited amounts of energy, but I mean, I'm 21, so I should do anyway, right? But I mean, it's 10 times more energy than I had before I was on carnivore, on a standard American diet, garbage diet. But the reason I stopped the lion diet is because it just kind of felt like something was slightly missing from my diet. I just enjoyed having some eggs with my steak. So essentially, purely a personal preference. If I didn't have these things called emotions, my diet would 100% be the lion diet, but I just like eggs. And that right there is the only real drawback of the lion diet, is that it lacks variety. Every single nutrient you need in the perfect quantities you can get from ruminant meat alone. My advice for you, pretty straightforward. If you're on carnivore, you feel amazing, you don't need to change a thing. But if you're still having a few issues, in particular with an autoimmune condition, mood issues, maybe you're feeling a bit tired, still got a little bit of brain fog, you've had a weight loss plateau. If you are someone who has one of those things, I highly recommend you give lion diet at least 30 days, but ideally, especially if you have a serious condition, I would give it 90 days because that's how long it takes to really feel the absolute full effects from it. But if you do decide to stick to a carnivore diet, there are 5 foods which I strongly encourage you to avoid. In fact, it'll shock you how harmful some of these carnivore foods actually are. So click here to see the video where I break these foods down.